Top elections official says Georgia is on track to finish its recount by tomorrow and that it will affirm Joe Biden's victory in the state. The announcement comes as a growing number of Democrats are blasting Republican Senator Lindsey Graham after stunning claims from Georgia's Republican Secretary of State that Graham hinted that he thought the Secretary of State should find a way to discard legally cast absentee ballots.
He asked if the ballots could be matched back to the voters, and then I got the sense it implied that then you could throw those out and he really would look at the counties with the highest frequent error of signatures. Well, it's just an implication that look hard and see how many ballots you could throw out.
Senator Graham disputes the claim, calling it ridiculous. CNN's Manu Raju is live on Capitol Hill. Manu, you spoke with Senator Graham today. That is a stunning charge of real shadiness. What else is Graham saying?
Yeah, a charge from a fellow Republican official. Graham is defending his efforts. He said that he simply had questions about the way mail-in voting is occurring in key states, raising concerns about the mail-in voting process to ensure that signatures are verified, that appropriate protocols in place to do just that. He revealed today that he didn't just call officials in Georgia, but also two other states in which Joe Biden is projected to win, in Arizona and in Nevada. And in my conversation with him today, he also contended that he was trying to push to see if they can make stricter those voter verification rules in Georgia ahead of the Senate runoffs that will determine the next Senate majority.
What I'm very concerned about is that if you're going to continue to vote by mail, that we need to know what systems work and what don't. It's up to the people of Georgia. But I think I have every right in the world to reach out and say, how does it work? And that's what I did. It's really, I thought, a pretty good conversation. So,
I mean, he thinks it was an implicit threat by what you were saying.
I categorically reject that. That wasn't my intent, and that wasn't the purpose of the conversation, to throw out ballots. We're talking about an election we haven't even had yet, which is the Senate races. That was my focus.
And part of the reason why Lindsey Graham has gotten so much backlash is because he's a close Trump ally. He's a chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee that has no oversight over these election matters. He's also a senator from South Carolina, not from Georgia, Nevada, or Arizona. Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, I asked him if he's okay with what Lindsey Graham is doing. He said, ask Lindsey Graham about that. And Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, called it reckless.
So he called three states that Joe Biden won. He didn't happen to call the elections officials just north of South Carolina in North Carolina, where Trump won. That didn't occur to him. Just the ones that Biden won. That's interesting. Let's discuss. Manu Raju, thanks so much. So first of all, let me start, Abby. President Trump and many Republicans obviously refusing to publicly acknowledge that President-elect Biden is President-elect Biden. But today on the Senate floor, CNN team saw not only Senator Lindsey Graham give Senator Kamala Harris a fist bump, but other Senate Republicans, including Tim Scott and others, appearing to congratulate incoming Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Abby, what's your reaction when you see that?
It's so interesting, Jake, that these Republican lawmakers would be willing to congratulate Senator Harris and I think in one case discuss with her what would happen to her Senate seat back in California, but not acknowledge that this election is over and that Joe Biden is the president-elect. It just really highlights that all of this is, to some extent, perhaps they view it as some political theater, although I think we all know that there are real-life consequences to misleading millions of Americans about whether there is a real chance that these election results can be overturned.
Right, not to mention not allowing the transition when it has to do with COVID or the troops in Afghanistan. Jackie, Lindsey Graham, he's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. What do you think the response would be if the Democratic chairman of the House Judiciary Committee started calling elections officials in states that Trump won narrowly, like North Carolina, and asked about absentee ballots? What do you think the response would be from the MAGA media?
Oh my gosh, I feel like Fox News would be ablaze and you could see it from space, but that is not what's happening here. You even had the Secretary of State in Georgia, one of his top aides who was at the call, back him up and say that Lindsey Graham's impression of the call is incorrect. And the Georgia Secretary of State is telling the truth. It's extremely ham-handed, and frankly, I don't know a lot of Republicans that would appreciate anyone getting involved in the federal level into their state. States are held at and states' rights is kind of a Republican thing. So the fact that Lindsey Graham had just kind of wanted to see how things worked in Georgia, it's none of his business, and you can only extrapolate why exactly he was doing that. But I have a hard time believing it's just because he wanted to see how things work.
Yeah, Abby, Senator Graham told Manu that he just had some innocent questions about verifying signatures on ballot, what's going to work. But CNN has learned that Georgia expects to finish its recount by tomorrow and affirm Biden's win. What's your take on what Lindsey Graham was actually trying to do?
Well, it's pretty clear that the president and his allies are searching for any evidence that they can find of fraud. They have found none so far, but they're searching desperately for it. And one of the main avenues is looking at the signature verification, specifically the way you sign your ballot and it's matched up against another signature that is on record. And it sounds like what the Secretary of State Raffensperger was saying was that he was inquiring about the rate at which those are thrown out and whether that could be an indication that they could imply that there was widespread fraud. This is a fool's errand, I think, largely because states that have signature verification are among the most stringent for mail-in voting. And it's just evidence that they're looking for something where there's really nothing. I think this idea that you could throw out votes in bulk is so frankly anti-democratic in nature. If anything, if you're going to throw out votes, they would be thrown out on individual merits, not on a whole. And I think this whole idea is just one that is pretty disturbing when you really think about what the implication is of all of this.
In fact, the Secretary of State of Georgia said, Jackie, that there are 24,000 more Republicans that voted in the primary than voted in the general after Trump began his crusade slamming vote by mail. And there's your margin of victory right there for Joe Biden. 24,000 Republicans who voted in the primary, but not the general election when Joe Biden won by almost 14,000 votes. That's it. If Trump's looking for a reason as to why he lost, it's because he demonized vote by mail.
Well, right, which is why you had in other states like North Carolina, I'm not sure if the Georgia GOP did this, they were trying to unring that bell. And there are Georgia Republicans now that are worried about the runoffs that are coming up in January, that the president and his allies keep continuing to slam Georgia, continuing to slam how Georgia is doing this recount is going to diminish the trust in the Georgia election even going forward. So perhaps Lindsey Graham should look at that if he's actually, as he told Manu, looking toward the next election, because that's something that we're hearing from our sources that Georgia Republicans are actually concerned about.
And Abby, Democratic Congressman Hakeem Jeffries is now calling for a Justice Department investigation into Lindsey Graham. Do you think it might actually go that far?
Well, probably not in the next 60 days under the Trump administration. And it's really still an open question even after that, if Justice Department would be engaged in any kind of investigations like that in a Biden administration, because if the reporting is correct, the Biden is sort of trying to tamp down on some of this talk. I do think that this is one of those things that you might want to let go. And it's also not clear how explicit what Lindsey Graham said was. I mean, clearly the implication was there. Raffensperger, who's a Republican, took it one way. But Graham is really playing, I think, a kind of dangerous game here. If he's implying to election officials that they ought to do something that they think is unethical or potentially illegal, it's just not a game you want to play if you're a sitting United States senator.
Yeah, but as you note, the Secretary of State of Georgia says it was an implication, not a direct order. That might be the difference between an investigation and not. Abby Phillip and Jackie Kucinich, thanks to both of you. Appreciate it.